One of the most prominent civil rights movements is the African American movement. However, during the 1960s, several other movements took place as well, with similar goals. Latin Americans, American Indians, and Asian Americans all faced heavy oppression and discrimination, and during the 60s, they too fought to bring equal rights to their ethnic groups. Although these movements focused on different ethnic groups, they all had similar beginnings, which provided them with the common aim of creating cultural identities while securing equal rights and opportunity.
All of these movements had their roots in the decades leading up to the 1960s. For instance, the Japanese American Citizen League, JACL, formed in 1930 with the goal of equality and opportunity for Japanese Americans. The National Congress of American Indians, NCAI, similarly began in 1944 and advocated for the protection of land rights and better quality education for Native Americans. Another association was the League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC, which was created in 1929 with educational equality for Mexican Americans in mind. The early efforts of such organizations helped set the stage for activism later during the 60s movements. In addition, Asian, Latino, and Native Americans were all involved in World War II. Comanches and Navajos contributed to the war effort by acting as code talkers. They helped transmit radio messages confidentially in their native language. Likewise, Mexican Americans, notably in integrated units, and Asian Americans participated in World War II. Members of these groups risked and sacrificed their lives for the American virtues of freedom and equality, but experienced discrimination after the war. Even during the conflict, certain Asian American citizens faced a violation of their rights with Executive Order No. 9066. This inconsistency brought the issue of racial inequality to the forefront. It emboldened Asian, Latino, and Native Americans alike to be more vocal in their call for just treatment and equal opportunity, planting the seeds for their future movements. In this way, all of these movements had their beginnings in the years leading up to the 1960s.
Of getting rid of discrimination, each movement had different main objectives and levels of lasting success for the future. Native American Indians wanted government support and funding as well as equal opportunities. Differently, Natives also wanted their land back. This group of people were now struggling to get jobs and in the conditions in which they were living. The Native American movement focused to make the quality of life better for all tribes in America, whereas the main goal of the Asian movement was to have their cultural roots accepted in the U.S. Discrimination was seen towards the way Asian Americans would dress, eat, and more. Overall, the Asian American community wanted to be recognized and accepted for their culture. The Latino movement, on the other hand, focused on rights for farmers and better quality education. Farmers were being mistreated and even went on a hunger strike to prove their point. In addition, people of Latin American descent felt that education was not as good as it was for other Americans and that a language barrier should not be an excuse. With the help of Cesar Chavez, Mexican Americans fought to be better treated as farmers and have a better opportunity by reforming education. Eventually, multiple civil rights laws were passed to attempt to end racial inequality within America, but laws could only do so much to people. In the modern day, it is not uncommon to realize that discrimination is still present. But unlike original views in the 60s, interracial marriage, equal opportunity employers, and highly ranked school systems are very common today. Today, Native Americans have worked out better deals with the government, Asian culture is widely accepted, and Mexican Americans receive equal educational rights. Although all three cultural movements wanted to fight back against discrimination, each of their main objectives and lasting success differed from each other.
Goals. They all aim to reform the educational system and create equal learning opportunities. In the 1960s, the Latin American movement used similar nonviolent methods to that of the African American civil rights movement. The 1968 walkouts occurred in 4 of East Los Angeles high schools, in which the students demanded more Latino teachers and staff and classes on Mexican American history. The city of LA ultimately complied to some of the movement's demands and established a Mexican American Education Committee. Contrastingly, the American Indian movement chose to use a more aggressive approach in order to seek educational reform. Rather than staging walkouts like the Latin American movement, American Indians decided to use similar practices to that of the Black Panther Party by taking a militant stand. American Indians used aggressive force by carrying heavy arms in order to force the government to bring educational reform to the communities while still respecting their cultural identity. This ultimately proved to be successful as the 1972 Indian Education Act was passed in order to give American Indian parents more control over their children's education. While educational reform was not one of the Asian American movement's top priorities, many young students chose to protest racial segregation in schools. Overall, despite using different strategies, all three movements successfully created some equal educational opportunities for their different ethnic groups.
While each movement prioritized equal legal rights, such as in the fields of voting and education, they also sought socioeconomic integration as a key proponent in the quest to obtain cultural equality. However, for the Native Americans, social integration far succeeded the abolishment of the designated colored signs commonly found at public facilities, as their entire culture was confined to reservations. Reservations, as they still exist today, are plots of land designated by the government to various Native American tribes under the authority of the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, or the BIA. In November of 1969, a group of approximately 200 Native Americans gathered to protest the BIA at the infamous Forsaken Alcatraz prison because they felt Alcatraz symbolized reservation living conditions. Native American reservations often lacked basic necessities such as running water and health care. Unemployment within reservations was over 10 times the national average, and 40% of the reservation population was living under the poverty line. Latin Americans were suffering similarly below the poverty line, as their previously mentioned unequal education rights often led them to obtaining low-income jobs that did not support their families. However, while Asian Americans faced less economic discrimination, they, like the Native Americans, battled residential discrimination. The Asian Americans took action similarly to the Native Americans. Thus, in the early 1970s, a group of Asian American students marched on Seattle, Washington for the purpose of preserving Seattle's International District, which housed various Asian American neighborhoods, to combat a series of construction projects which destroyed parts of the district. They later formed a series of civic organizations to acquire funds from the city to preserve the neighborhoods, ranging from community health, care of the elderly, historic preservation, and low-income housing. However, today both Native Americans and Latin Americans are among the poorest ethnic groups in the U.S., and reservations as well as the International District are still prevalent in separating Native Americans and Asian Americans from other sectors of society. Despite the efforts made by each movement to obtain socioeconomic equality, each ethnic group remains on the lower end of the spectrum.
The Asian American, Latino, and Native American movements, with their similar roots, shared the goal of overcoming adversity and gaining equality for their ethnic groups. In the end, they all had a profound impact on American society, influencing the perceptions of future generations. For instance, without these movements, debates on issues such as illegal immigration likely would not have gained as much political attention today. These movements succeeded in gaining greater acceptance for certain minorities, shaping the United States in the modern day.